Welcome to ADF TV. My name is Nimphius and I'm from the Oracle, JDevelop and ADF Product Management team. In this session, we talk about PL-SQL integration in Oracle ADF, and it's the fourth out of 4 sessions on this topic. What we have to discuss in this section is how to access stored procedures from the client. That means from the ADF view layer or the ADF controller. In addition, we want to summarize what we said in the previous chapters and derive some best practices for you to look at and follow. So let's start with accessing stored procedures from the client side. Now, to access a stored procedure from the client side, we need first to think about what type of functionalities that we're accessing here. And we will get to the point where I hope you agree with me that mostly the stored procedure functionality that we access is data-centric. So that has to do some sort of querying data or with DML operations. Though triggered from a client, they're not necessarily belonging on the client because they don't have anything to do with changing client state or component state. For this reason, the first recommendation is to access stored procedures through a Java method exposed on the business service. Because if it's on the business layer, then no matter which client is accessing that logic, it will be consistent. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation, as you're working with Oracle ADF, is to always work through the binding layer. So that is that you use operation binding or a design time that will expose as a method binding to access the stored procedure. So let's have a look how that would look at design time, purely from an architecture point of view, of course. In this image, you see 2 access to a stored procedure exposed on the business service. And the stored procedure is exposed as a method on the ADF Business Component Application Module impl or the View Object impl. Both can export client interface methods. Yeah? And the way you do this is you go to the View Object, then you go to the Java options in the editor, and then there is one of the options to create the client interface. And it allows you to choose from a public method that you have exposed on one of the input classes. Now, once you have this on the business service side, you want to access this from the client. Here on the screen, we do have a button to access this functionality and a managed bean. So that is if, for instance, you want to invoke a function on a stored procedure from a value change listener. So something that is just not direct user interaction, but just as a result of user interaction, user changing data, so you want to call out to a stored procedure to validate the data or just to update data, whatever. To get this routed through the binding layer, which we recommend, there are 2 options for you to follow. One is to declaratively create the button to invoke the functionality. I think that's the most easiest and straightforward. You just go to the data control palette, you expand either the application module node or the view object node, and then you drag and drop the client method onto your view. And then in the dialog that pops up, you choose button or command link, whatever you want to use. Now this will create the entry in the page definition file, and whenever the user will press the button, it will invoke the stored procedure. The other option is where you need to create a method binding in the page definition file. And if you look at the visual editor, at the bottom there is a tab called binding. If you click on that, and there's a binding section which has a green plus icon. If you click on that and choose generic bindings, then you will find an entry called a method binding, or an operation or action binding. However, to invoke that from a managed bean, there's a little bit of code required, and the code, it's not too long. It's just binding context, get current binding entry, and then get the name of the method binding as it's in a page dev file, and then you call execute on that. However, quite some code. You want to avoid writing code most likely, or just look for a declarative option. One option is just to start with what I said, just drag and drop the method as a button, double click on it, and then when you double click on the button, a dialog opens asking if you want to create an action against a managed bean, and you can choose to build a new managed bean, or you can choose an existing managed bean. And then there is a checkbox for you to check if in the code it will create, in the step for this method, if it should generate the code that is required to access the binding layer. And because you dragged and dropped the method and created the button from the method, it will exactly wire up to that method binding. Try this out, pretty straightforward. Later on you just remove the button and keep the code in the manage bean. So we have two options to work through the binding layer, and the reason we want to work through the binding layer is that we want to have a consistent API. So we don't want to have anyone trying to reach out in its managed bean directly issuing a JDBC call. So we want to go through the business service as a central place to where we put the logic. This is how you do this from the view. But how do you do this now from the controller? Say on the controller you want to invoke a stored procedure from a method binding or method activity, or you want to invoke it from a router activity. Now how do you do this? Well, again, we have two options here. One is to declaratively just drag and drop the method onto a task flow diagram, and then it will be created as a method activity, so directly wiring up. But what it will do is it will also create a page definition file for the method activity, and that is the secret here. A method activity and a route activity, they can have page definition files. And whatever you put into this page definition file is accessible for these activities. If you don't want to create it using drag and drop, you can just go onto the method activity or the route activity, right mouse click, and then you choose go to page definition file. If that file doesn't exist, it will be created, and then you can manually edit and add anything that you want to access from the router or from the method activity. So this is the way to go to it, and again it will work through the binding layer, which means that whenever you work through the binding layer, error handling will be consistent as well, and error handling is one of the next topics I'm talking about. Right, so that was what we had to cover as a new topic, accessing a stored procedure or function from a client and a controller. So let's look into best practices. Before we start with best practices, let's look a bit back to what we covered so far. So we started in one of our first recordings, actually the first recording on PL-SQL recording. We talked about the motivation for users to use stored procedures and stored functions, and we came to the conclusion that it's even valid to use stored procedures in new IDF projects, not just to use legacy PL-SQL stored procedures, but also create new ones. Because for a language reason, PL-SQL is the language of the database. It's a type language. It's a very powerful, strong language, and it is portable. Yeah, so you can go from one operation system to the next. If you have the database installed there, your stored procedure will run. Then we do have people that are highly skilled on PL-SQL because they have a PL-SQL background, or people who have legacy applications, legacy infrastructures. Maybe they're coming from Apex or coming from Oracle Forms. I'm not saying that these two are legacy technologies, but actually they are a good reason to work with stored procedures. And if you want to reuse the logic that you created for these two products, then there is an option to do that in ADF as well. And then we talked about security, PL-SQL APIs. This is what we talked about in the second recording on PL-SQL integration, where you want to protect direct access to a table using stored procedures. Now these three arguments are sound and are good to justify the use of PL-SQL from ADF. However, there's a bunch of things to consider and to keep in mind when you do this. The next picture, actually this one here, it will show the architecture that we recommended in our second recording. So what you see here is, reading from left to right, you have two clients accessing stored functionality. We have an ADF client, and we do have a third-party client, which could be Oracle Forms. Now the stored procedures and the functions that you have in a database need to be such so that all clients can access the functionality, and if you want to have a SOA client there, it should be able to use the stored functionality as well. So instead of trying to find the universal API for your stored procedures in the database, we recommended to put an application-specific layer in front of your stored procedures that you use currently with different technologies, because this would allow you for a specific technology or application to translate the stored procedure functionality, which might not be easy to digest for the technology that acts as the client, to translate that so that it's convenient and can be used. Now for Oracle IDF, we do have a bunch of options to do that. So from the application layer, we can either go with a native Java access, or we can use a web service access, be it a SOAP access or a REST access. And then of course, and that's partly part of the native access, from ADF Business Components we can have entity objects and view objects that use Java to read and to write to stored procedures. So that's the architecture. And now we get to our best practices. The first best practice is that you should separate Java logic that deals with PL-SQL from application logic. And the reason for this is because you want to be flexible. You want to be able to change things later on without rewriting your application. So define a set of APIs that the client works with and then just route it to a stored procedure. And if you're going to change stored procedure usages in the future, you would just replace this with Java calls or callouts to a service maybe. When you work with that, try to identify what could become a utility class. You might have common access to stored procedures. You find yourself calling stored procedures passing 3 arguments more than passing 7 arguments. So you can put this into a utility class. Always keep in mind that not every developer is highly skilled on the use with stored procedures. So if you can wrap things up so that they just have a very clean API which is easy to explain, and then the internal details will just be handled by someone who knows what he is doing, then that's definitely the most proactive way of dealing with stored procedures. We covered in the second recording and the third recording how to create entity impl files and view object impl files to route ADF Business Components client calls to stored procedures and how to update through ADF Business Components leveraging the caching. That also should be taken into consideration. As said, always try to avoid anything where you have to deal with low-level DWC calls. Just have the overall framework doing that for you. And if you look at the use of stored procedures, we pointed you to a blog document by Avram Federman. Think about parameterizing code and write it such that it's generic. So generic entity impl classes, generic view object impl classes, because that will add benefit to the productivity that you're later on. So the next set of recommendations is, well, just starting at the bottom, there is a mismatch between database types and Java types. Some of the database types are not even available in Java. So that means there is some sort of transformation you will have to do, and we recommend that this transformation should be, if possible, in the database, because here it's centric, and of course it's easier to adapt the PL-SQL landscape to the Java API than the other way around. And if you did it once in the database, then no matter how many applications you have accessing the stored procedure in the database, they all benefit from that. The second recommendation is that you carefully watch what you're coding. If you identified areas in your code that you're over and over using, basically you're duplicating code, think about putting that into utility classes or put this up the call hierarchy, which means just make it a superclass that you then extend in your view impl classes, entity impl classes, or wherever you want to use stored procedure calls from. Finally, IDF is not a container for PL-SQL. So if you're an expert in PL-SQL and if you're tasked with an ADF job, take the time and learn Java. Java is a primary language in ADF and for ADF. We do have a little bit of a mismatch between the Java world and the PL-SQL world. One mismatch is that in Java we use Java EE connection pooling to access the database. So that means we cannot rely on global variables. We always have to commit the change that we perform to the database. We cannot have pending transactions in the database. We do have 2 transactions basically. We have one managed by the framework, ADF Business Components or EJB, whatever you choose, and the database. And you have to make sure they're synchronized in their commits and in the rollbacks. So there's a little bit of work to do. So the best option really is to see what part really requires PL-SQL and then only code for that and use PL-SQL here. And then the other best practice is, and I can repeat it 1,000 times for you because it's so important, always work through the binding layer. Never ever work around. Because if you work around the binding layer, there are 2 things that you will achieve. First of all, you will have wild growing API usages. The code will be harder to read, people need to be more skilled than they need to be to work with ADF. And second, the binding layer is not at all aware of any data changes that happen on the business service. So if there's a view object that your binding layer is based on, and if you have a table that is kind of displaying the data, and then if you work around the binding layer just to call a stored procedure, the whole chain will be unaware of that change. So you want to limit or just minimize the risk that the binding layer doesn't become aware of a change. So these are the best practices I had to share with you. So this concludes the PL-SQL integration talk. So it's a valid option to use ADF with PL-SQL and stored procedures. And again, if you go to the Fusion Developer Guide, there's a full section written about using stored procedures, using ref cursors, using PL-SQL in general with ADF business components on the entity level, on the view object level, and beyond. Yeah? Have a look there and you'll find a lot of tips there. So this training only covers principles and concepts. We're not covering implementation details, but this is what you find in the documentation on various blog entries, and if you have a question, just post it on OTM.